muted all the time, so it doesn't disturb. We can also mute them from here, but it's better that you are aware that your microphone needs to be muted. And of course, when you speak, turn on your microphone. Of course, let's try to be succinct, maximum 3-4 minutes for each intervention, also because the interpretation will end at 5 o'clock. So with this technical 5 o'clock Copenhagen time, of course, I have to be aware that there are different time zones. But today's seminar should have been moderated by my colleague, Andreas Baker, who is in charge of the third committee. Unfortunately, Andreas had a situation in his family, so he couldn't be with us today. So I'm sitting in at his place. But, in the future webinars will also be moderated by my colleagues who deal with the respective committee and the respective ad hoc committees. I'm very pleased that today with us we have two high-level experts, the director of the ODIHR, Gisela Todiev, and the president of Freedom House, Mr. Abramovitz from the United States. This is the second webinar in a series of OSCE PA webinars where we try to look at the situation and the impact of COVID-19 on political military dimension, on the economic environmental dimension, and today on the human rights, and also we had a recent one on migration. We had a committee meeting on migration. We will have a webinar on migration and on issues of fighting terrorism. Today's focus is on democracy and human rights, and after a few months where some states have implemented state of emergencies, we want to look into what is the situation, how far the states have gone into implementing state of emergencies, and what kind of impact it has had on human rights of our citizens in the OSCE participating states. So before giving the floor to our distinguished guests, I will ask our president, George Aratelli, who is also connected now, to say a few things, and then to Kyriakos Adijani, the chair of the OSCE PA Human Rights Committee, also to make some remarks. And after that, we will move on to our two guest speakers. Mr. President, you have the floor.
Thank you, dear Roberto. Dear friends, dear colleagues, let me greet you first. And thank you for joining us today at this webinar. I don't know how many countries are tuned in at this moment, but maybe it's quite a few. It's a big audience. I'd like to.
Excuse me, Mr. President, if I interrupt you. Indeed, I should have said this. We have around more than 100 participants and from 35 countries.
Great. So we have now more than it was before.
Yes.
And then thank you all of you. I hope you are all all healthy and in good spirits, despite of these troubling times here and everywhere. And I look forward today to hearing not only our excellent two guests, and I'd like to once again welcome them. Being speakers today, it's really important and interesting. But also from many of you who have debated, I think, these topics in your own parliaments in recent weeks. So this is the second the webinar in our series of web dialogues, as Roberto already mentioned, that the OSCE PA is organizing. And it's, of course, not quite the same as the meeting in person, but I think this is a good adaptation already of our work. We all are accustomed to the new rules. What we'd like to do today, we'd like to continue to support this interparliamentary dialogue, and I think you will all agree that there are many challenges we have to discuss and address as we grapple with this crisis. 2 weeks ago, some of you have participated in our first web session, focused mostly on economic fallout of the COVID, this new pandemic. And we had also very interesting guests at the time. Particularly, I'd like to remember the words of Mr. Schlagenhofer, who is the Deputy Director of OECD. And he said that our actions these days will determine trust in our systems in future. And he was discussing the economic consequences, but the comments are perhaps even more relevant to our discussion today on democratic fundamentals. As I have repeatedly stressed already, since the start of this crisis, including through a joint statement with the presidents of PACE and NATO Parliamentary Assembly, parliaments have a key role to play to ensure that emergency measures are implemented properly and in accordance with democratic standards, and that restrictions on freedoms are proportionate and temporary. And I have said it before, but also will repeat today, it's maybe easy to maintain our principles when times are good, but the real measure of our commitment are seen when times are difficult and bad. This is the situation we are facing these days. I'd like to thank our third committee for their activities, for being quite active in raising the issues, opinion pieces and press releases, and also today for this webinar. And I encourage all of you to relay the spirit of our discussions also in your home countries. I hope when this is all over, we'll be able to look back and say that we held true to our commitments even at this difficult time. So thank you very much once again for being today participant of this important and interesting webinar, and I look forward to hearing your discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I give the floor to the chair of our Human Rights Committee, Kyriakos from Cyprus.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Secretary General. And I want to thank, first of all, Andreas Baker for the excellent organization of this meeting. Thanks again also for the perfect and substantial work to Andreas Baker, and of course to Vice Chair Michael Lin, and to the rapporteur, Mrs. Carney. Thank you also all for joining us today, the big number. We must not allow ourselves to drop our focus on human rights these days, even if there are other pressing concerns. I hope this will help keep attention on some of the very important rights questions before us. We have dealt with states of emergency in the past, different kinds of emergencies. In the final declaration of our annual session in 2018 and in 2017, several clauses referred to this issue. Last year in February also, in the OSCE PA Human Rights Committee that I have the honor of chairing, we held a somewhat similar debate exploring the scope of legitimate restrictions on human rights in time of emergency. But that was before anybody had heard of coronavirus and was largely theoretical for most of us. Now, these questions are a reality for most of us. I think it is not necessary to explain how extraordinary a situation this is. We feel this is at the personal level, at the political level, and at the economic levels. Obviously, states of emergency is not restricted to countries officially using this term. Any conferral of exceptional powers to the executive needs to be scrutinized. For example, freedom of movement, privacy, and data protection. How do we respond to the use of tracking apps that monitor movement or other means of surveillance? Furthermore, how do we deal with restrictions to the right to freedom of assembly, which is largely incompatible with social distancing? How long can our democratic system accept a world in which the right to gather in group is not possible? Additionally, how do we protect the freedom of expression and the freedom of the media? And what about rights under humanitarian law? How are people in conflict areas or occupied territories protected? How is their access to humanitarian assistance guaranteed? There has understandably been a great deal of focus on how to revive our economies after the crisis. But equally important is maintaining our human rights principles. We must address the health of our population without forgetting the health of our democratic system. Colleagues, in our own parliaments, many of us will have recently voted for the first time in our parliamentary careers to grant our government exceptional emergency. This was probably quite difficult for some of us, as it challenges some basic aspects of parliamentarism. I firmly believe that Parliament has a crucial role in providing oversight and democratic control of government. So the question remains, how can we fulfill these responsibilities at the same time as giving governments extraordinary powers? Each country has taken different approaches, but almost all of us have accepted at least some restrictions on our human rights. Most notable in this regard is the right to freedom of assembly, which is largely incompatible with social distancing. How long can our democratic systems accept a world in which the right to gather in group is not possible? All of our countries have agreed to certain basic commitments in this field. Among other things, emergency restrictions must be strictly limited to the requirements of the situation and must be not discriminatory. I would also add that it is necessary that restrictions are limited in time, but of course, the details are important and vary between country to country. You may have seen that together with Michael Link and Kari Henriksen in our Human Rights Committee, I expressed concern last month that in Hungary, emergency powers were granted to the government without a clear end date. On a practical level, many of our parliaments have also changed the way we work. Some are now using electronic voting systems to continue work, whereas others are enabling voting by other remote means, and still others are instituting special social distancing within chamber of parliament. As a closing remark, allow me to know that it is becoming increasingly obvious to me that in order to be able to maintain our relevance and added value in our work as an assembly, there must be a mechanism through which we as a committee or as an assembly will be able to monitor in a meaningful way the application of our human rights and rule of law commitments in cooperation with national member MPs. I would be interested to hear different examples on how parliaments have effectively adapted working procedures, particularly when the focus is on maintaining democratic oversight mechanisms. There is much to discuss, but I now look forward to hearing from our two expert speakers and then hope to hear from many of your colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Halijani from Cyprus. Of course, at the end, Vice President Kari Henriksen will also wrap up. Kari Henriksen is the rapporteur of our third committee. But now let's move on to our guest speakers, and it gives me great pleasure to first introduce the director of the OSCE ODIHR, Ingebjorg Gislatodיר. Ingebjorg has been a mayor, has been a member of parliament, probably also member of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. I'm not sure while you were MP if you were in our assembly, Gislatodир. She's been foreign minister, and also she knows very well the international organization by being a director of UN Women for a long period. So nobody is better placed than you, Gislatodир, to give us a nice presentation on these important issues. So without further ado, I will give you the floor.
Thank you, Roberto. Mr. Tsereteli, the President of the OSCE PA, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm really grateful for the invitation and also the continuing close dialogue and cooperation that we all have between ODIHR and the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. As has already been mentioned by Mr. Kyriakos, we are going through quite challenging times, and there are a lot of challenges to the democratic system during the COVID-19 pandemic. I think we are all hearing it over and over every day that we are in an unprecedented situation. And so we are dealing with things now for the first time and trying to find proper solutions to all these things that are coming up. This is a severe stress test to democracies across the OSCE region and is putting pressure on democratic institutions and also on the safeguard of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Because, you know, with all these measures taken, with adopting emergency status, we are kind of challenging these safeguards on human rights and fundamental freedoms that we have taken for granted. And we might also become a little bit, there might become ambiguity around it in this situation. The national parliaments must, of course, play a crucial role in shaping our democratic response to today's crisis and tomorrow's solutions, because that's also what is shaping now. It's the solutions for tomorrow, and it's important that national parliaments play a crucial role in that. And they have to ensure that the representation of all voices in society, a relentless oversight of governments, and the inclusive and transparent adoption of legislative measures. I would like to compliment the work of OSCE Parliamentary Assembly in advancing multilateralism and allowing parliaments of the OSCE to exchange good practices, questions, and ideas on how to respond to this global crisis. There's a lot we can learn from each other, successes and mistakes. And that is important to use the convening power that the OSCE PA has to bring together parliamentarians to share the best practices and also learn by the mistakes of each other. ODIHR, in line with OSCE commitments and the cooperation with the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly and also OSCE field operations, is closely monitoring the effects of the states of emergencies on human rights, on fundamental freedoms and the rule of law. This includes also how national parliaments have been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic in their functions, looking at good practices as well as cases of concerns, because we have both. If I may share three main observations resulting from this initial research that we've done. First of all, a warning, secondly, a lesson, and thirdly, an opportunity. First of all, the warning. Today's crisis is starkly exposing and widening pre-existing cracks in our democratic systems, aggravating those underlying preconditions which have been affecting democracies in recent years, such as low levels of trust in institutions and processes. Secondly, a growing toxic political polarization. And thirdly, a weakening of the balance of power in favor of stronger executives. You know, all these cracks were already there, but they are kind of more exposed and aggravated in this time of crisis. This was about the warning, but following this dynamic, a number of parliaments across the OSCE region have been unable so far to shape national responses to the crisis, with disruptions of parliamentary agendas, cancellations of plenary and committee sessions, and significant limitation to their oversight functions, either voluntarily, because they have decided so, or under the pressure of their governments. Despite all the challenges of the present situation, we need to ensure, and that is a quote to the OSCE participating states adoption in 1991 in Moscow, to ensure that the normal functioning of the legislative bodies will be guaranteed to the highest possible extent during a state of public emergency. This was agreed by OSCE participating states in 1991 in Moscow. Now more than ever, parliaments should effectively perform their historical role of guarantor of fundamental freedoms at a time when they are at high risk of being abused. And moving to my second point, the lesson, when faced with an unprecedented crisis, several parliaments across the OSCE region have also proven able to quickly adapt and respond effectively to the pandemic. Their actions and flexibility in reshaping their work, amending regulations and embracing new technologies, asserting oversight through special committees or parliamentary inquiries, boosting transparency and inclusive representation. This all teaches us how parliaments can perform a key role in addressing today's crisis and upholding democratic principles. There are a lot there, to learn from the parliaments that have been able to quickly reshape their work and play a very boosting transparency and inclusiveness and being very much up to their task. To better research these good practices and share them across the OSCE region, ODIHR is now collecting information from national parliaments on a weekly basis. Moreover, my office is also developing a dedicated study on e-parliaments and the use of new technologies, which will offer useful knowledge for future assistance in this area. And that brings me to my last point, the opportunity. As politicians, experts, and scientists across the globe are advising us, the world we will find at the end of today's crisis will be considerably different from the one we left behind. We should expect our democracies will be different too. And when the old is dying and the new is not yet born, here lies the opportunity we must seize to make sure that better, more inclusive and responsive societies are being shaped. So it's really an important time now. We are at a conjunction of a very different time, and we have to grasp the opportunity to shape the future. Parliaments and their members must play a fundamental part of this transformation, rethinking their interaction with the citizens they represent, modernizing their work and procedures, investing in transparency, reinforcing their voice over governments in ensuring balance of power and inclusive decision-making. The quality of our democracies in the post-COVID-19 world will largely depend on whether parliaments will be successful in leading this transformation and, at the same time, transforming themselves, the way they work, the way they go about their connection with their constituency, their citizens, and how they can modernize and rethink their interactions. ODIHR, of course, remains ready to provide assistance to all parliaments of the OSCE region in this process through dialogue and cooperation. We are now mapping this situation. We will make public briefings on specific themes and topics, and in the end, we will come up with a report where we are kind of assessing how the participating states did implement their in this situation, the state of emergency, and that is for us to be the lesson learned and can maybe guide us into the future. But I stop here and thank you again for inviting me to participate in this meeting. Much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gestadottir, Director Gestadottir. Ingeborg, your camera was not on. I hope that you'll manage to fix the camera for the Q&A part. But thank you very much for your presentation. I also appreciate very much the cooperation. Yes, now your camera is on. I very much appreciate your presentation, but also very much appreciate the work that we do in very cooperative fashion between our respective institutions. And I think we will have a lot of work to do in the coming months with the many upcoming election observation missions, and trying to devise also some creative ways of conducting election observation missions in these challenging times. But now we move, Mr. President.
Good to see Ingeborg now, because I really miss you, and thank you for joining us today. And you had a very precise points, and I think our collaboration in this regard, in this very difficult time, it will be effective. It's necessary. It's essential. So thank you, Ingeborg, for being with us and cooperating with us. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And I think probably, Ingeborg, you when you unmuted yourself, you turned off your camera, and I didn't want to interrupt during your intervention.
But I hope you can both see and hear me now.
Yeah, now it's perfect. Now it's perfect.
Now I will mute myself.
Okay, but keep the camera on. Very good. Our next speaker is Michael Abramovitz, president of Freedom House, an organization that many of you will know is an organization whose research many of us consult and use regularly. Their expertise related to democracy, political rights, civil liberties is well known, and their annual publication, Freedom in the World, is known as a standard setting comparison of global political and civil rights. By the way, Freedom House 2022 Nation in Transition survey was just released, so I invite members to look at that. Before joining Freedom House 3 years ago, Mr. Abramovitz was the director of the US Holocaust Memorial Museum Levine Institute for Holocaust Education, and he was previously a national editor and a White House correspondent for the Washington Post. Mr. Abramovitz, dear Mike, good morning to you, and thank you very much for participating, and we all look forward to hearing from you. I give you the floor.
Okay, well, good afternoon to my friends in Europe, and thank you very much for having me. Thank you, Roberto, and it's really quite an honor for me to speak to you all, and I'm looking forward to hearing from what you're experiencing in your own countries as well. As Roberto said, I used to be a journalist, and one of the things I used to cover was the US Congress and state legislatures in America. So I know how important the work that all of you do. So thank you for that. This is a very challenging time for everyone, including here in the United States. So I enter this discussion with a great deal of humility and respect and eagerness to hear your views. As Roberto said, Freedom House tracks the state of political rights and civil liberties around the world. And in general, we have been very concerned over the last 10 to 15 years about the general deterioration of democratic practice all over the world. And we're very worried about what the deterioration that it might accelerate as governments take new steps to control the pandemic. And as has been noted, many countries have adopted emergency measures which do offer the opportunity for abuse of human rights. As you outlined in the concept paper for this webinar, there are broad standards that should apply to emergency restrictions. One, that they're being limited to the situation and being proportionate. Two, being consistent with other legal obligations. And three, being non-discriminatory in nature. Let me just add a few other points that we would add, that these restrictions should also be limited in duration and should be transparently communicated to the public. And we also think it's very important that legislative bodies be able to continue their functioning as much as possible. And we know that these issues are complex and require careful consideration in order to balance the demands of responding to the emergency with the challenge of maintaining democratic practice. So with that in mind, let me just highlight three specific categories that we're concerned about in general with respect to rights and democratic practice, and this would also include countries in the OSCE region. One would involve violations of freedom of expression, that we have seen a spread of new measures to criminalize quote unquote false information with measures in countries as diverse as Russia, Azerbaijan, Hungary, Bulgaria. And even in those cases where the laws are not yet applied, these kinds of measures can have a chilling impact on speech. We saw initial measures in certain countries to force journalists only to report official information, as in Moldova and Serbia, and we're very glad to see that these have been rolled back. And we're very concerned that journalists and social media users are continuing to be arrested in Turkey. We note especially the accusations against journalist Nursan Baysal and against Fatih Portaco based on their social media posts. And there is an ongoing lack of issue of access to information in many settings when a lack of information presents a serious threat to public health. And we very much support the representative on freedom of the media's call to let journalists work freely and without favor or fear. And we're also concerned about human rights defenders being targeted. And we have seen that those who have spoken out for the rights of others, who have sought to mobilize aid to those most affected in the crisis, being targeted in countries like Russia and Azerbaijan. A second broad category of issues that we're concerned about are elections. We really see free and fair elections are a cornerstone of democracy, and it is important to expand a variety of other voting procedures and to adopt registration and in-person voting procedures in order to make it possible for people to have equal access to voting. However, this process cannot be implemented quickly. It needs time. And in some cases, the most appropriate action in the short term may be to postpone the vote while new measures are being implemented. This is obviously very much of a moving target. You know, we've had some concern about the vote in Poland that's been scheduled for this weekend, but that seems to maybe perhaps have been put off for a number of weeks. And they're also concerned about what's happened in Serbia, where their elections scheduled for April are now back on the agenda for June 21st. And with the pandemic still an issue and the possibility of a spike in cases, we do worry that in both these countries, circumstances will not permit free and fair competition between different parties. A third issue that I would highlight is surveillance. We know that technology can play an important role in responding to the pandemic, and we know, but it's very important that we be mindful of maintaining firewalls between public health uses of personal data, whether in aggregated or in individual forms, and law enforcement or national security uses. So let's be clear that the pandemic is a serious public health emergency, but that does not make it appropriate to apply national security measures to combat it. So let me just conclude by highlighting two underlying themes that unite all of our concerns here. One, this is not a time, in our view, to make dramatic, permanent changes limiting the rights of individuals. With the functioning of parliaments limited and the ability of political actors to campaign and engage less than the normal times, it is inappropriate to take permanent steps criminalizing false information or make permanent changes to the laws on assembly. The goal should be to limit changes during this time as to what is proportionate, legitimate, and scientifically necessary, not to take actions that were sought before the crisis. And it is very important that elections be free and fair so that the political consequences of the crisis do not live on for years. It would really be a shame to see a breakdown in public trust as a result of a rushed political process during the crisis. The second major area is that the crisis should not be a pretext for governments to go after opposition or for the opposition to target the government in bad faith. We are not asking for the suspension of politics. Democracy demands competition, and even in emergencies, there will continue to be political jockeying. But we urge all political actors to work in good faith at this time within the parameters of the legal framework. And we have seen a disturbing trend in parts of the OSCE region toward a breakdown in parliamentary tolerance for the other side. And it is crucial that governments look for ways to strengthen cooperation across party lines, inside and outside of Parliament, in order to improve responses to the crisis. So I want to thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to hearing the comments and questions. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mike. For all participants, but mainly for Mike and Gisla Dodir, you, Ingeborg, have been a parliamentarian. Mike, you've worked for Congress. You know that when we have this kind of seminars with members of parliament, it's not a classical webinar where we just have questions for the two speakers, but the members of parliament use this platform also to make their own remarks and to make comments on what you said. So they will not just ask questions, but they will also be able to intervene and to talk to their other colleagues. And so far, I already have 16 people who have enrolled to speak. We have 35 countries represented. So many of the countries that you've mentioned in your comments, Mike, are here represented. And I'm sure you will hear some reactions or some presentations from those countries. So we'll start with a former president of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, Congressman Alcee Hastings from the USA. Alcee, you have the floor.
Roberto, Mr. Secretary General, and my dear friend, President Saratelli. George, it's always good to be with you. The two previous speakers were very illuminating, and I am deeply appreciative of their remarks. And I'm just real pleased to be in the Assembly on this webinar. My granddaughter isn't with me, so I don't have the capacity from my home here in Florida to push up my video of myself. But when she's around, I'm able to do it. It's interesting. But anyway, despite the distances that keep us apart and all of the things that we are going through, this is, in my view, what the Assembly is doing is finding ways to communicate, cooperate, and collaborate. At last year's annual session, I was the lead sponsor of a supplementary item on the role of civil society, individuals, and non-governmental organizations in realizing the aims and aspirations of the OSCE. The resolution we adopted in Luxembourg acknowledges the critical role civil society plays in enhancing security and cooperation across all OSCE dimensions. I appreciate President Saratelli appointing our colleague, the Honorable Pia Kalma, as the Assembly's special representative to be an advocate for civil society engagement. And in my view, she has done a great job so far. I'm sorry, but not surprised, that some governments have taken the need for emergency measures as an opportunity for repressive measures. Hungary is the only OSCE participating state that does not have a sunset clause for the expiration of its emergency measures or requiring parliamentary approval for an extension. Parliamentary oversight is essential, especially when governments seek to exercise extraordinary power. I believe we must also pay particular attention to those measures that relate to freedoms of assembly, and that has been mentioned, association, and expression. I'm also troubled by the heavy-handed disciplinary and punitive approach utilized in some areas, which exacerbates existing discriminatory and unconstitutional policing. I want to thank you, Director Ladauteur, for your attention to this and speaking out against the hate crimes and scapegoating of minorities, refugees, and migrants. In the next legislation that will come before the United States Congress, I will support provisions to address hate crimes and other forms of discrimination in our societies recently heightened by the pandemic. But I'd like to pause here for a moment to reflect on violations of fundamental freedoms that some governments had already imposed even before the pandemic. If a law or practice violated OSCE human rights and democracy norms before the pandemic circumstances, now will surely not cure that violation. Threats against journalists, restrictions on academic freedom, imprisoning people for their political views, and impeding or even criminalizing NGOs' access to and communication within and outside their own countries, all of that is still inconsistent with OSCE commitments, and the pandemic does not change that. Principle 7 of the Helsinki Final Act still holds. Individuals still have the right to know and act upon their rights. I therefore add my voice to the international calls from OSCE and institutional bodies and others around the world for the release of all prisoners of conscience given this pandemic. Prison populations are particularly susceptible to community spread. To address dangerous overcrowding, governments should work first and foremost to release those in prison for exercising their internationally recognized rights or those wrongly imprisoned contrary to international commitment. I seriously regret Turkey's decision, in particular, to approve a plan to release 90,000 prisoners, excluded relief for any of the thousands of political prisoners, including opposition politicians, civil society activists, employees of U.S. diplomatic missions, and many more. Which brings me back to the important work of Special Representative Kalma. Civil society is not a luxury. It is essential. If anything, it becomes even more important during an emergency when governments may legitimately exercise powers, but those powers may not be unlimited, unchecked, or unending. A vibrant civil society plays a critical role in holding governments to account, particularly at times of great social stress. Those human rights groups, the parent-teacher organizations, book clubs, the food banks, all enrich our societies. Colleagues, this pandemic has upended elections across the OSCE region, as Mr. Brummel just went through some of them. According to the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly's fact sheet, 40 OSCE participating states, including my own, have elections scheduled for this year. As we all rise to meet the challenge of conducting elections safely, we must maintain transparency regarding the entire electoral process, especially any changes to the timing of elections, methods of voting, or measures that impact campaigning. The United States is already debating these issues in preparation for November. In addition, we are debating remote voting. Even in a pandemic, international and domestic election observation remains vital. We must find a solution to ensure that they are engaged and included even now. Mr. President, I think back to the period when I had the honor of representing this organization, how feeble my effort was in talking about teleconferences, and now we're up to Zoom and webinars. But I am excited that we are doing this, and I know it will save us a lot of time and also give us an opportunity to learn best practices from each other. Thank you all so very much for permitting me to make remarks.
Thank you very much, President Hastings. I see you have brought many issues. I'm sure there will be many reactions to what you said. I just want to remind speakers of the 3 minutes rule if possible, because we have a lot of people also signing up now. Soon we will close the speakers list because otherwise we exceed 2 hours. Or we could exceed 2 hours, but we will do it without interpretation after 5 o'clock Copenhagen time. The next speaker is Vice Chair of the Third Committee from Germany, Michael Link. Michael, you have the floor.
Hello, Roberto. Hello, dear colleagues. Can you hear me? Can you see me? Okay, perfect. So it's great to see how many people are interested in our webinar in the Third Committee. And I fully underline what our chair, Kyriakos, said in the beginning. Let me highlight only 3 aspects which I think need to be maybe additionally highlighted in light of what we have heard. But first, let me say I'm especially happy to see Ingibjörg Gísladóttir, my successor at ODIHR. It's great to see that ODIHR is doing a job which is absolutely irreplaceable. Let me begin with what you mentioned, with your let's say, assessment of how parliaments are reacting. That is most welcome. And maybe, just as an idea, it's not only a report, but maybe you could also include some recommendations which can be then actively being taken up either by individual parliaments or by us as PA later on to be decided, maybe as a motion, as a supplementary item or whatever. Definitely it would fit in our report in the third committee. So having the report is good, but with some recommendations would be perfect. On the state of emergency, I think it is absolutely crucial that it is being used with restraint. Elsie Hastings rightly noted, it is being taken as a pretext by many governments to further curtail human rights who anyway wanted already to do so. And the pandemic is a welcome excuse to do so. So this is the thing we need to see, we be aware of. And therefore, it is so important that also wherever you have a parliamentary majority, also this is being used with restraint. That is why we as third committee addressed some individual cases in our press releases where we have concern, where parliamentary majorities have been, we think, overstretched by having regulation that gives de facto the power exclusively in the hand of the governing party or of the governing prime minister. So let's keep minority rights really, really, really in mind. It is extremely important that we not only have limited state of emergency and controlled state of emergency, controlled by parliaments and courts, but also especially that we have the possibility for parliamentary minorities also to have the possibility always to question and to withdraw this state of emergency. It's extremely important. The other point, what I wanted to stress is the extreme way of how fake news are flowing in. Conspiracy theories, all this is really troubling. And in the guise of this, of course, also hate speech and hate crime, especially hate speech. And also in my own country, in Germany, we see with great concern how anti-Semitism is rising. It's a job for parliamentarians of civil society to fight. It is something we take very serious, and especially today, on where we have the important day when we have the end of the Second World War. It's May 8 today, where we Germans are fully aware of the crimes which have been done at that time, and we have to say never again. Therefore, we see with concern the rise of anti-Semitism, of anti-Ziganism as well, and in the state of emergency, let's not forget, also domestic violence is rising. We are having, at least in Germany, I'm sure it's the same with you, dear colleagues, we really have problems with domestic violence. And that is something where especially women and children, of course, are suffering. Another reason why we should really limit in time, in scope, and in possibilities this state of emergency. My last point, elections. And there it is extremely important, again, that we do not use these elections as a pretext to cling to power in situations where you need a real electoral campaign. Poland has been mentioned. It's good news that these elections had been postponed, but that is only a half victory. Still, the plans are on to have only a mailing system, a vote-in system, a mail-in system, something like this. Therefore, we should, as OSCE PA, and maybe also Ingeborg can say her views on that situation, how we can guarantee that electoral campaign, I mean, that is a genuine part of an election. The campaign is also being safeguarded. And that is why long-term observation is so important. And I hope very much, of course, that we together insist on the importance of campaigning and we do not allow elections to be reduced to remote voting and to mailing. My final word, let's not play civil liberties against security. Civil liberties are fundamental rights. Security is a public good. It has to be provided by the state, and we need to find the balance. And in finding the balance, the parliamentarians are crucial. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you very much, Michael, especially for this conclusion. The next speaker is Pia Kama, our Special Representative on Civil Society. Pia. Pia, we don't see you, but we will probably hear you.
Do you see me now?
We hear you, but you can go ahead. It would be nice to also see you.
Maybe it's coming. All right. Dear Roberto, dear George, Kyriakos, Mr. Hastings, and colleagues, good to see you all. Even if this is a virtual environment, I'm pleased that the important about this occasion. I'm also pleased that the important work of the PA continues so actively, even under these exceptional circumstances. I would like to raise a point related to my post as civil society special representative. Obviously, the responses of different governments to this COVID pandemic are disrupting civil society globally. Civil society activists in all fields are facing the same challenges as all of us. Social distancing and lockdowns make it more difficult to make their voice heard than in normal conditions. However, their work remains as important as ever. Perhaps it is even more important now because we and other politicians are largely unable to travel. In these circumstances, civil society activists with their local connections may still be able to alert us about their special areas of concern and expertise on a local level. Dear colleagues, civil society groups are clearly also facing difficulties related to organizing demonstrations. The curbs on gatherings of groups in many of our countries are an understandable limitation of the freedom of peaceful assembly now, but they really should be imposed with care, as demonstrations are an important tool for many civil society groups. I hope we can all also be sensitive to their messaging these days, even if they are not gathering in large protests. Why I'm raising this point is because it really worries me that in many countries, restrictive laws had already been shrinking civil society space even before the crisis hit. The pandemic provides a convenient cover for some governments to further tilt the balance of power in their favor. Unfortunately, due to the downturn of the global economy, all our countries are likely to be looking for savings. I think we should not cut off funding to NGOs because it can have long-term consequences for expertise and advocacy. This in turn can be damaging to all of our democracies and societies. Dear colleagues, I would like to also raise a point related to democracy. I think this was a topic also addressed by, for example, Kyriakos and Mr. Abramovich of Freedom House and many others. You know, in Finland, my political party is in opposition right now. Maybe if I was in a ruling party, my glasses would be a little bit different and I would see it a little bit differently. But as I see it now, coronavirus in some countries have given the governments a lot of power, and some of them would be willing to use this power and the situation to use their power even more than the pandemic situation would require. As politicians, we need to be very aware of this, and we need to work even more to make our voices heard, and also to make sure that we listen to others, namely the voice of the civil society. I do think that we need to protect democracy in every way that we can, also in these exceptional times. Otherwise, we risk losing something very essential when it comes to rule of law, division of powers, and human rights. Dear colleagues, thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, PM. Now from Helsinki to Baltimore, Senator Ben Cardin, Special Representative on Combating Anti-Semitism. Senator, you have the floor.
Mr. Secretary General, thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you for arranging this conference. I just want to join with Congressman Hastings to let you know that both the House and Senate in the United States strongly support this conference in respecting human rights and maintaining democratic control during states of emergency. This topic is critically important. As parliamentarians, we have a responsibility to ensure that the measures we introduce and which our governments implement are consistent with the OSCE standards on human rights and democracy, including the 1991 Moscow Documents commitment regarding states of emergency. Those actions must be necessary, proportionate, transparent, and temporary. Emergency provisions which restrict freedom of speech or freedom of the media are especially concerning and may actually undermine our efforts to address the healthy emergencies. Let me just underscore the points that Odir and Freedom House made, that we are talking and fighting to preserve not just our health, but the health of our democracy. And I particularly want to express my appreciation to those that have mentioned specific countries. We have a responsibility to be specific as to our concerns. Mr. Bromwitz, thank you for chronologically providing us information on specific countries that have acted in a way inconsistent with the OSCE principles. We need to ensure that journalists, medical professionals, scientists, and others can provide the public with information we need to battle COVID. Muzzling independent voices undermines public confidence in government at a time when the confidence in public cooperation is critical to the success of safety measures that we need. We've talked about civil societies. Civil societies are critically important, and we have to fight to preserve that. They may be telling our government officials things they don't want to hear. They may be pointing out mistakes that are being made by government, but it's critically important that that information be allowed to get out. So I want to thank the President and our Special Representative on Civil Societies for the work that you are doing. We also need to ensure that civil society's voices continue to be heard within the OSCE. As we look ahead to how the participating states organize human dimension activities this year, and particularly the annual Human Rights Dimension Implementation Meeting, it is critical that we preserve the access and openness that we have made in the OSCE to the defenders of human rights. Whether OSCE meetings are in person or online, those standards of access must be maintained. Finally, democratic institutions, including rule of law, the independence of the judiciary, and free elections must be preserved even during an emergency. I think this is really one of the most important contributions that was made by the 1991 Moscow document. It speaks to these exact points. It states a state of a public emergency may not be used to subvert democratic constitutional order. The participating states will endeavor to ensure that the normal functioning of legislative bodies will be guaranteed to the highest possible extent during a state of public emergency. The participating states will endeavor to ensure that the legal guarantees necessary to uphold the rule of law will remain in force during a state of public emergency. That's what was adopted in '91. We have to make sure that it is implemented in 2020. We may need to make changes on how we hear the different mechanisms within our elections. We understand that, but we got to make sure that our elections proceed as being free and fair. But the health emergency does not diminish our commitment to ensure that we proceed with our elections in a manner that's consistent with the OSCE principles. All of us must work to make sure that we preserve the basic principles of the OSCE, which will be even more challenged today. Thank you very much, and thank you for your for putting this conference together.
Thank you very much, Senator. Our next speaker is our Vice President, Margareta Sederfeld, who is also the chair of the Migration Committee. And on the 26th of May, by the way, she will organize a webinar on migration issues with our colleague Farina. Vice President Margareta Sederfeld, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary General. Mr. President, and as well as the members of the first committee, Mr. Kyriakos Arianos, Mr. Michael Link, and Ms. Kari Henriksson. Thank you very much for arranging this important seminar. And I am also very grateful that the Assembly can meet despite the challenging circumstances. Exchanges of practice is a key to handle these challenges. It is crucial that we as parliamentarians are able to adapt to current circumstances and continue our international cooperation. I will use this this short time to describe the measures taken in the Swedish parliament to be able to function during the ongoing pandemic. How we act as we see that democracy and the respect of the result from the election is a key, it's crucial for our country and for the democracy, of course. What we have done so far is that the key issue for us, as I said, it is to maintain the parliamentary decision-making power and as well to exercise parliamentary control over the government. And to do this, we don't know for how long time the COVID-19 will go on. We don't know how it will affect our society. What we have seen so far is that the society is affected. And we have seen that it's restrictions on travels. Our authorities says as well, keep distance to each other. And it's important for us to follow them. So what we have done so far is that there is a decision, because it's a state of emergency, every second week that we should limit the number of parliamentarians in the parliament. We are 349 MPs and we continue to be 349 MPs, but we have reduced the number of MPs who take part in the votes that we continue with every week, Wednesday and Thursday, to 55. And it's the lowest number of MPs we can have with respect of the election result. And by this, we can guarantee that there is a government, a parliament who are acting. As there is always some MPs who can be there, even if quite a lot of us should not be healthy or not be able to travel. I would also like to say that this number of 55, it's appointed every week, and it's the party who appoint and choose which of the party group should take part. For my party, it's 11 MPs who take part in the election, the voting every week. And it's varied between us, so it's not the same MPs. What we also have done to secure that our committees can work is that the committees meets every week on usual time, but we use internet. We have web meetings or we have phone meetings. There is always one MP at the meeting, and the rest we handle on the social, not on social media, but on the web or the phone. But this is, of course, it means as well that it's important to be aware of the security risk. Normally, we meet in a closed room. We might not have even our technology with us, our cell phones or our computer. But now we have to depend on the technology. And this is certain risks about the video system. It's about also who attending around us, for example. Then what we also have done to guarantee that it's the MP, the member of the committee, who vote for the bills, adopt the bills that should go further on to the chamber for the voting. It's that we have formed a general committee, and their only duties is to adopt the bills that have been, the bills that have been prepared by the different standing committees. And in the general committee is the number of MPs there is 15 in respect of the election result. And so far our work have gone very well. We do also have debates, and it represents from the party. It's I have had, for example, 3 debates so far, and there are other colleagues to take their debates. What I also would like to say is that the the parliamentary control over the government proceed as usual. We as parliamentarians, we do still have to approve the government's proposal. And we as parliamentarians do still scrutinize the government by written questions with interpellations. And for me, this works quite well. And we have a limit for the time this should go on. It's when it's state of emergency, and it's only for 2 weeks each. And I do, as all of you, look forward a day when we have handled the COVID-19, that there is no longer a risk, that the parliament can work normally, that we can handle our democracy in a proper way. What I see as a risk, besides how the parliament works, is the meeting with our with the society. As there is restriction to meet with each other, how can I, as a parliamentarian, I think this is an issue for all of us to think about, meet with the voters, how to connect to my constituency in a proper way? Because as we see here, there is one dimension we lack when we have these meetings on internet. It's the personal contact. And I think this is a parameter we need to be very, very careful of when we talk about democracy. And thank you very much for giving me the floor.
Thank you very much, Vice President Sederfeld. Next speaker is Ferran Costa from Andorra. Just for the participants, Michael Abramovich has to leave at 16:30 Copenhagen time, so in 20 minutes. So if there is anyone who wants to ask a specific question to him, please make it in the chat. I'm talking also about those who are speakers after.
Roberto, after the speaker now from Andorra, our colleague, then I would like to make a short intervention before Mr. Abramovich will leave. Okay.
Yes, he will leave at 16:30 our time here in
Before
Copenhagen
he
time. So yes, so those who want to ask him a question, maybe also put it in the chat, and we will try to have Mike wrap up before he leaves. Next speaker, Ferran Costa from Andorra.
Thank you very much, Roberto, and thank you very much, dear colleagues, for attending and putting together such a seminar. It's really useful, specifically at these hard times, to be able to still gather together and to reach all our different points of view as we would normally do in normal times. Having said that, I would also like to share with you what kind of measures here in the Parliament in Andorra. All our activity came to a halt back in March, on March 13. Our little country is landlocked between France and Spain, and we largely depend on the tourism industry. Our economy depends on that. So you can imagine the huge impact that has had on our country, also with the restriction of the fundamental right of traveling around, because of course we are landlocked, as I said, within our 465 square kilometers. The very first day that the parliamentary activity came to a halt, we realized that we had a lot of work ahead of us. Our constitution, which dates back to 1993, contemplates a state of emergency, but in the last 27 years, no one in the parliament really took the time to legislate on that. So we realized that one of the first mechanisms that was necessary to put into place was to legislate about this state of emergency. At the same time, additional legislation to tackle the economic problems that all the companies in Andorra and workers would face needed to be put into place, and also an adaptation of our reglement. So using Zoom meetings, all the parliamentarians started to work very hard in order to legislate and have all those new 3 laws implemented. Shortly 2 weeks after, we already had a regular parliamentary session, but limiting the number to half of the parliamentarians, contemplating the same proportion for each one of the parliamentarian groups. So that session was held, and unanimously, those three pieces of legislation were approved. Of course, keeping all the sanitary measures, the social distancing, and so on. We're happy to announce that in Andorra, all the actions and measures implemented by our executive have been done so on a voluntary basis, which means that the state of emergency has never been activated. So with a lot of work from the government, raising awareness to how important following the confinement measures and all the other measures that took into place, those have been done on a voluntary basis. So again, this state of emergency that we activated has never been put into place. We also legislated on a second law with additional economic measures to tackle this crisis, which went on, of course, longer than we all expected. And right now, we're at the moment of this normalization of activity. The parliament now is working again, keeping all the sanitary measures, keeping social distancing, keeping the numbers of parliamentarians in each session. Commissions are back to work. And for example, next week, we have a control session to the government here in the government. So we also want to think that this crisis will show some lessons. And one of them is the opportunity ahead of us. All the digitizing of our work should also help to become closer to the voters and to the citizens. So in that respect, we want to think of this crisis also as an opportunity. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Ferran. President Tsereteli.
Yes, thank you, Roberto. I think was this part, I think, which we already heard, was extremely interesting for everybody. There are examples, there are important issues which have been picked up, especially by Mike Abramovich, and once again, I'd like to thank him for his activities and activities of his organization, which is one of the most reputable institutions in the world when it comes to human rights and when it comes to freedoms. And those issues are, I think, most, I would even say, painful at this moment. And one of the most important things and value for our activities is that no any government should consider that there is any excuse to curtail democracy or to somehow try to misuse the power which they gained at this moment. That's why it's very important also to hear from opposition parties how they feel, what the cooperation between opposition parties and governmental parties. This is very important at this moment when we're talking about scrutinizing governmental issues, because there are different examples when governments, they are quite distant from the opposition, and opposition's voices are not very well heard during those times when people need assistance, when there are special programs, when there are reshuffling budgets and restructuring budgets, and all this could be misused. And especially I'm stressing and linking this issue with another issue, the elections. And several speakers also outlined that. There was very good intervention from Elsie Hastings and Ben Cardin, and I see Roger Wicker also. It's great that our American friends are with us and they're taking part. This consolidation and a joint effort is very important. But we should be very vigilant when it comes to elections in certain countries. I'm not talking about my own country, which also planned elections in October, but there are other countries too, which postponed elections, there are planned elections, and these few months until October or November, those are crucial times. And that's why everybody should understand, and we should be very, very vigilant with ODIHR, with the other institutions, the Parliamentary Assembly, to follow all the events and try to force all the political forces for the agreements, for the cooperation, and to, let's say, to exercise all the democratic principles, and of course the legislation and internationals to meet international standards. Otherwise, there's a big threat that at the election time, there will be a lot of complications, even maybe attempts not to recognize elections, because this time is very sensitive. It's not usual. We never conducted elections under emergency rules, or even post-COVID few months when pandemic will gone. Anyway, that will be very, very difficult, to enjoy, to give all the freedoms, and to not to violate, and not to, let's say, not to have these attempts from the governments. And we know in many governments there are such plans. So that was my remark, and maybe we can be focused on those issues more concretely. So once again, thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to continuing with you.
Thank you, Mr. President. With Yasmin Posios from Sweden's permission, I would now first give the floor to Vice President Azai Guliev, because his country was mentioned in the presentation of Michael, and then so Michael can reply, because I'm sure Vice President Guliev wanted to maybe probably make his presentation while Michael is still present. So Azai Guliev first, and then Yasmin Posios from Sweden. Vice President Guliev. Your microphone, Azai.
Thank you, my friend, dear Roberto, Secretary General, President Senatori, distinguished colleagues. First of all, let me to greet all of you from Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan, and express my sincere gratitude to the International Secretariat for this important event, webinar on such issue respecting human rights and maintaining democratic control during states of emergency. Before starting to talk about the suggested topics for today's webinar, I'd like to make some clarification, Mr. Secretary General, as you rightly mentioned, that some of the speakers have mentioned the name of my country and put some issues that need to be answered. First of all, I do personally have, to be honest, an impression that the information that Freedom House is taking about Azerbaijan is not enough accurate, and I really have some doubt on the reliability of these sources. If you look at the real situation, we have really to think that those accusations or blame have nothing to do with the reality. Let me also disagree with the assessment on media situation, because I'm really afraid that this information not only inaccurate, as I said, but even biased and baseless. This is why my recommendation would be to our guest speakers, before issuing any report, please try to double check all facts that you are receiving from different resources. Why I'm saying like that, because in the context of fight against disinformation and misinformation related to COVID-19 pandemic, the National Parliament of the Republic of Azerbaijan on 17 March 2020 adopted amendments to the law on information, informing and protecting information. According to the changes, the owner of the information internet resource is obliged to prevent any dissemination of information that is detrimental to the life and health of people, able to cause damage to property of citizens, a massive violation of public safety, the activity of vital objects in the field of finance, transport, communications, so on, and other dangerous consequences. Thus, amendments to the law are aimed to crack down coronavirus disinformation and misinformation, as well as to reveal fake experts. I can assure all of you that there are no politically motivated decisions when it comes to those who have been held responsible for violating quarantine regime. Government of Azerbaijan, as in other Western countries, is trying to make sure that every citizen are obeyed the law and rules so that to save the lives of others from infecting coronavirus. As a matter of fact, I could say that there are dozens of people or perpetrators, if I can call like that, from ruling party who have been fined or detained for breaking the laws on quarantine regime. Also, for the last 3 weeks, 5 heads of regions have been arrested for corruption, crime, and abusing their power. Dear colleagues, now I would like to draw your attention to the fact that the Azerbaijan experience of fight against coronavirus implies the implementation of a number of restrictions without declaration of emergency as it was done in 35 OSCE member countries. It also helped us to avoid the potential issues related to the human rights. The population's understanding of their social responsibility is among the reasons of success of this measure. Special quarantine regime in Azerbaijan has started since 24th of March, while the borders were closed a week ago prior to this decision. From April 27, we have started gradually softening of these restrictions. At present, several restrictions are still enforced only in 5 major cities of Azerbaijan. It is necessary to point out that Azerbaijan has become a significant contributor to the multilateral cooperation and global response to COVID-19. Azerbaijan was among the first countries to join the international effort to contain the pandemic, also contributing $10 million United States dollars to World Health Organization. Moreover, my country provided technical assistance to more than 10 countries upon their request. Azerbaijan, as the current chair country of Turkic Council and non-aligned movement, has successfully organized the extraordinary video summit of the Turkic Council on 10 April 2020 and online summit level meeting of the contact group of non-aligned movement in response to COVID-19 on 4 May 2020. Promotion of human rights and worldwide solidarity, as well as coordination of international efforts and global response to pandemic, became the main outcome of the online summit of non-aligned movement, embracing 120 countries, initiated by President of Azerbaijan, Mr. Ilham Aliyev.
Vice President Guliyev, just no, because Mr. Abramovich has to leave in a few minutes. So if you want him to react, just try to wrap it up. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, as for the Parliament of Azerbaijan, I would say that my parliament has demonstrated its flexibility and held the continuous work without any slowdown in their lawmaking activities. It was decided to hold the plenary sessions and committee meetings via web-based tools in accordance with recently adopted new provision to relevant law. Mr. Secretary General, as you mentioned, there is no time to conclude, but at the end of my speech, I'd like to ask our Secretariat to consider, or maybe Bureau to consider the joining the initiative put forward by the Secretary General of United Nations about the year of creative economy, with the main emphasis on promotion of international cooperation in the economic, social, cultural, educational, and health fields. I think that taking this great opportunity, the OSCE PA can and should promote the further parliamentary diplomacy in order to tackle this pandemic. Thank you very much, Secretary General.
Thank you very much, Vice President. And indeed, we will discuss this proposal of yours in the next leadership meeting at the end of May. Now I give the floor to Mike to conclude, to make his remarks before he leaves us, and then we will continue. Mike.
Roberto, first of all, let me thank you and your colleagues for allowing me the opportunity to talk to this group. It's been terrific, and I am particularly heartened by the fact that many of you, share the concerns of Freedom House about the potential threats to human rights and democratic practice around the region. and around the world for that matter, and we really appreciate that. Let me just say in general about specific scores, about specific statements that we make. We try to be very, very transparent about our methodology, about why we make our assessments in general. I'm not talking about any specific country, but there's just a huge amount of fact-checking and rigorous assessment that goes into our process. And I would say this to every one of you: if anyone has specific concerns about our country assessments, you are free to write me directly, and I will look at what you have and I'll discuss it with my staff. We try to be very transparent. If you go to our website, you'll see that, for every one of our reports, if we make a change in a country's status, we explain why we're making that decision, and so people may agree or disagree, but we're very transparent about that. And I would just also say that in general, as the comments on this call reflect, I think many of our assessments of human rights and democratic practice are shared by other experts. We are not alone in the concerns that we express here. But what I will do, and I promise you, I will use the chat function to share my personal email at Freedom House. And if people want to follow up with anything specifically, and I would also say if we are always interested in partnerships, and if you have ideas for Freedom House of things that we can do with people in your country, please let us know. And so with that, I will just thank you. I'm sorry that I have to sign off. I have a meeting with some of my members, some of my trustees, but I've really appreciated the opportunity to talk with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for your time, and thank you for sharing your email, and we'll definitely pursue any possible way of cooperating with your organization from our side. Next speaker is Yasmin Pozio from Sweden.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear and see me?
Correct, yes.
Well, wonderful. And thanks to Gisladottir and Abramovich for your contributions. This pandemic has shown that there might be situations when governments need to make decisions prior to passing it through the parliaments. In the beginning of April, the Swedish government proposed a law to the 8 parties in the Riksdag, but it was immediately criticized since it was too wide and didn't include the possibility for the Riksdag to vote swiftly after the government had used the law. So this new law that now has passed the Riksdag states that the government should only be able to make intervention decisions if there is no opportunity at all or time to wait for the Riksdag's approval. All other possibilities must be exhausted. The government will now have more power to make quick decisions during this pandemic. The Riksdag will be able to test the government's regulations directly and repeal them within a few days if a majority considers that the government has gone too far. According to the law, regulations may be issued for example, temporarily restricting the gathering of people, close shopping malls and retail outlets, close restaurants, gyms, libraries, and museums. This also applies to ports, stations, and airports. The government is also able to decide to distribute medicines and medical equipment from private healthcare companies. We realize that there might be situations that are specific when that law needs to be used. But in order to safeguard our democracy, it was important to make sure that it was restricted and only applicable during this pandemic. Up to this day, the law has not been taken to use. When it comes to other laws that has a negative impact on people's lives and that has nothing to do with the pandemic, they should not be taken while this pandemic is putting our societies under big pressure. For example, laws that restrict abortions, freedom of speech, and labor laws. It is worrisome to see that countries are doing so when people do not have a fair chance to demonstrate against or even have meetings to talk about these laws. As democracies, we have to wait with those kinds of decisions until the civil society, NGOs, and people have the possibility to show what they think about laws that are suggested. And finally, I would like to stress the importance of acting together in solidarity, since we are all so closely linked to each other, be it families, friends, trade, or transporting of goods. We must stand up for each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Teresa Menace from Spain. Teresa, you have the floor. Teresa, your microphone. Your microphone? No, we cannot hear you. You have to unmute your microphone. Yep, now it's perfect.
No.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. I just was thanking you and for organizing this meeting, and I will show you update the situation in Spain on COVID-19 and the impact in my country relating to the human rights and the democracy control. I must say that the application of a state of emergency is always a breaking on democracy order. So we have to respect some fundamentals that should be taken in account on the time that we are living now, like exceptionality in any democratic state. The state of emergency is an exceptional measure intended just for problems that require an urgent resolution. So it cannot be resolved by ordinary legal systems. So is that what is happening in Spain? Now we are using the state of alarm. We have other states like exception, siege, but we are using a state of alarm. But the important thing for me, one of the important things is the temporary limitation. The limiting duration of every state of exception is important, as limiting the scope of this state. In our Congress, you have to ask for an extension to the Congress every 15 days, which is quite strange now in Spain. We have already done 4 extensions, and people are becoming to be really tired with this, and the government is saying they are going to extend again and again. So people, you cannot be restricted sine die, a state of alarm, because fundamental right couldn't be restricted indefinitely. No, also because now we cannot assure that the total risk will disappear in the short or medium time. So what the government has to do is doing things to avoid the extension of this pandemic. So what we say now that you have the alarm, the state of alarm, you have to make massive tests, because you have the possibility of doing this. It's the responsibility of any government to take advantage of this state to carry tests on citizens, because it's the only possibility of restoring the political and social order as soon as possible. It is very important what we're seeing about the limitation of fundamental rights. It's not acceptable that with the excuse of fighting the pandemic, a government decided to permanently limit rights or change the legal or political order of a country. For example, the right to assembly, maybe at the beginning, or the movement should be cut, but there's no point in cutting the right of expression or other rights that they are not they cannot be cut. Also, it's important the separation of power and checks and balance, that to guarantee that the rule of law continues to function is essential. The independence of the judicial system, the Constitutional Court and Supreme Court. The state of emergency should not be an excuse to hide information regarding, for example, the purchase of necessary medical supplies. All citizens have the right to know with complete transparency who, when, and how, and under what conditions someone has been able to benefit from a contract made by the state during the state of emergency. Also, the freedom to the press and the freedom of expression is very important now, because the government had a lot of power, so it's more important than ever. Also, it's important to avoid propaganda. The state of emergency cannot be an excuse either to prevent citizens from expressing their anti-government opinion through social network or for the that same state to try to buy wills from the media, opinion makers, or journalists through money from the public budgets. Civil society and the political opposition must remain vigilant to prevent the money dedicated to informing the population from ending up being money destined for propaganda to distort public opinion as appropriate. Also, it's important a quick and total de-escalation once the reason that led to the adoption of the state of emergency, the spread of the virus has ended, it's essential to restore the democratic order to the previous state as quick as possible. The state of emergency cannot be an excuse to make a permanent legislative change. Also, and for finish, if it's required, we need, I don't mean our country, but any country, it will be possible to have external observation when required. When all the requirements reflected in the decalogue of norms or rules are not considered, it is essential that multilateral organizations such OSCE, the European institution, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe or United Nations exercise this task of protection with respect of human rights and to denounce the abuse of power carried out in the shadow of a state of emergency. It's important to that the trust of the citizens is not lost in this with this pandemic. We are going to have a sanitary crisis, also a very hard economic crisis, but we cannot afford a democratic crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is the head of the Hungarian delegation, Zsolt Senger Zala. You have the floor.
Thank you for the floor, Roberto, dear colleagues. First of all, let me commend the choice of the topic for our conference today, respecting human rights and maintaining democratic control during state of emergency. We welcome this opportunity to share our views, and we hope for an open exchange of ideas about how others handle this unprecedented and serious crisis within their national competencies. The COVID-19 pandemic has posed an unprecedented challenge to countries of our continent. Today, the most important task is to protect human life and put a halt for the outbreak of this pandemic in accordance with our constitutional provisions, followed by the secure economic recovery plan. We are not only fighting the novel coronavirus. Concurrently, the spread of disinformation has exacerbated an already strained situation. Hungary has been subject to constant political attacks on various pretexts. This is highly disappointing in itself and further detracts from our capacity to focus on real problems, which in this case, first and foremost, is the safeguard human lives to protect health and safety of our citizens. When it comes to national measures to combat the coronavirus, Hungary has taken proportionate and solid, timely steps. On March 13, 2020, the Hungarian National Assembly passed a bill by the qualified majority enshrined in the fundamental law of Hungary, authorizing the government to extend the special measures for the duration of the time necessary to combat the outbreak. Unfortunately, since its adoption, the Act number 12 of 2020 has been the subject of sharp criticism. Let me state that these concerns are absolutely unfounded. The Act is fully in line with Hungary's fundamental law. The power granted to the government are limited, as it may only take appropriate and necessary measures exclusive in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, with a view to protecting life, health, and safety of citizens and economic stability. The Act doesn't restrict the power of the National Assembly. On the contrary, this is the only special measure in Europe that increases the power of the National Assembly vis-à-vis the government. The National Assembly has the power to decide and withdrawing the effect of the Act once the emergency passes. The Act clearly confirms the right of the National Assembly to revoke in whole or in part the mandate given to the government at any time, once again, at any time. Contrary to the false information that is spreading faster than the virus itself, the National Assembly retains its full controlling and regulatory power it holds regular sessions and monitors the action taken by the government during the emergency. Here is a picture about the last meeting session in Monday this week. This week we have 4 sittings in our parliament. The next will be in Monday. Mr. Link said in his speech that the voice of the opposition is important. Yes, absolutely, I agree with. Therefore, at the suggestion of the opposition to ensure adequate information for the government, the time usually available for interpellations is now reserved for prompt questions to members of the government. So currently, MPs wishing to ask questions do not need to formulate their queries 4 days prior to putting them for the National Assembly as normally required by the rules governing interpellations. Overall, even during the COVID-19 crisis, the National Assembly remains a well-functioning and sovereign institution, not limited in exercising its power, as it continues to make the decisions solely based on the interest of the Hungarian people, to whom it is accountable. The Coronavirus Response Act does not contradict any European standards, as it was recently emphasized also by Ms. Vera Jourova, Vice President of the EU Commission, responsible for values and transparency. We are confident that the content of the letters sent to the different European institutions and parliamentary assemblies on the role of the Hungarian parliament, the engagement of the Hungarian government at European level, and the statements of the EU Commissioner Jourova clearly proved that these attacks were politically motivated misinterpretation of the situation. And finally, we should continue our cooperation in this way, refraining from unfounded and politically motivated attacks, and instead focus on tackling security and other challenges that threaten our societies. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and I wish good health for all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Next speaker from Canada, Peter Bohannon. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Secretary General, President. Thank you also for inviting us to participate. I'd like to offer just a few brief comments about how we are viewing national emergencies in Canada and how we are looking at this from a legislative perspective. We have an Emergencies Act that was passed in 1988. It replaced an archaic act called the War Measures Act. The emergency, to have this invoked, has to be so serious or beyond the capacity of authorities at any level of government that it would be required to deal with it. Sorry. It has not been invoked like some of the other countries' representatives who've spoken in our case, and all of its measures would fall under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Other levels of government, the provinces and municipalities, have emergency acts and instruments and also have similar restrictions. The restrictions would involve time limits and continuous oversight, and at the end of it all, an inquiry as to what took place and how things could be improved. So far, we've had a pragmatic approach to this crisis, in that the Prime Minister and his ministers have dealt with their counterparts in the provinces, and it has not been invoked. There are concerns about mobility rights in our country. There are charter guarantees for mobility rights as well. There is the question of essential versus non-essential travel, which we are all dealing with, and the issue of borders, including interprovincial borders, but especially our border with the United States, which is as you all know, the longest non-militarized border in the world. So essential travel and trade only in that case by agreement with the United States government. We also have the Quarantine Act, which has been applied to Canadians returning from other destinations who are required to self-isolate under penalty for 2 weeks. If they don't, there is a penalty. We are concerned about freedom of expression and access to information. As Michael Link mentioned earlier, a concern about the rise of racism and stigmatization, which is particularly evident in social media. So the response here has been to have many briefings. The Prime Minister briefs the nation on a daily basis. There's a technical briefing following that. The premiers of the provinces do the same, and this is important in terms of getting the information out. There are concerns about other rights, the debate on the right to privacy. For example, if we are going to be using surveillance tools at some point to track people's movements, this is a concern, and also things like court proceedings. So if you have been charged with a crime, you should be guaranteed a reasonable amount of time to bring that forward for justice. On continuation of parliamentary affairs, this is a big issue for us. We are in 6 different time zones in our country. We are geographically very distant. So to have in-person meetings is difficult because from Ontario and Quebec, almost down here. And we also have the concern for virtual committees and how we meet. It is working so far, but we have concerns on bandwidth and all of the other concerns I think that many of you have. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Our next speaker should be Recep Akdag from Turkey, but I just wanted to double check something, Recep. Is Vice President Victor Dobre going to speak in French? Because if you are going to speak in French, then I give you the floor now, because our interpreters are leaving in 10 minutes. If you speak English...
Yeah, Akdag is here.
I don't know.
In English.
In English. No, I'm asking Victor Dobre to speak in French. Victor, we don't hear. Yes.
You hear me?
Yes, we hear you. Will you speak French in your presentation or in English? In English. Okay, then I will give you the floor later on. Okay, Recep from Turkey.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, COVID-19 is a global threat to the health of all people around the world. We are deeply saddened by the loss of many lives and all suffering. In order to combat the COVID-19 outbreak, Turkey did not declare state of emergency, but has opted to pursue its efforts by adopting necessary measures in line with legal framework. Some countries declared state of emergency and resorted to the right of derogation from their international obligations. Having respected the various measures taken by countries with good intentions, as a physician and former Minister of Health who served for almost 12 years, I'd like to stress one significant point, that access to health services by all citizens under the umbrella of universal health coverage is inseparable part and a vital essence of human rights. Unfortunately, in this pandemic, we have seen that some countries couldn't provide the healthcare services for the elderly appropriately. In that respect, Turkey believes that access to health services by all people without any restriction is a fundamental human right. The transformation of health system in Turkey accomplished between 2002 and 2013 has always prioritized this belief and established a resilient health system providing necessary services for all of our citizens and asylum seekers, refugees in our country without any discrimination. Thanks to our resilient system, Turkey has already had its pandemic plan ready to enforce, empowered affiliation teams on field, and increased the capacity of intensive care units dramatically. To combat COVID-19 pandemic, all our institutions and facilities are mobilized, first and foremost for the protection of the right to live. Additional to elderly people, people suffering chronic disease and refugees, those deprived of their liberty represent another vulnerable group. In this context, our National Assembly amended the law of execution of penal sentences that recently entered into force. So far, approximately 95,000 prisoners met the requirements, have been released. The law also increases health measures for penitentiary institutions to prevent the spread of COVID-19. Finally, I'd like to point out that international cooperation and solidarity is a must to fight such a pandemic, since there is no boundaries or border security for a virus. Virus can and does penetrate any border. COVID-19 outbreak has proved that to be successful in crushing such pandemic, all states are to be sure that international community would support one another with full solidarity. Only if states are sure of that support, they would be transparent enough to international community to share necessary information and start fighting before it is too late to contain the disease. In this sense, Turkey has stood with the international community by providing vital medical supplies to approximately 60 countries and will continue to do that in the upcoming days as well. As the 13th century Sufi Mevlana Jalaluddin Rumi says, after hopelessness, there is so much hope, and after darkness, there is much brighter sun. Thank you for your kind attention.
Teşekkürler, Mr. Minister. Next speaker is Michaela Olivia from Azerbaijan.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General, dear Mr. President, distinguished guests, colleagues. I'm greeting all of you, and first and most importantly, I hope your families and your loved ones remain in a good health and safe during these uncertain and unprecedented times. As we are all aware, the current coronavirus pandemic is continuing its fast spread across the world with more than 3.5 million confirmed cases, and is turning economies and our daily... Oh, I'm sorry. Do you hear me?
Perfect, Julia. Continue.
Okay, thank you. As we are all aware, the current coronavirus pandemic is continuing its fast spread across the world with more than 3.5 million confirmed cases and is turning economies and our daily lives upside down. We are therefore convinced that once again, this pandemic is a test not only of our healthcare system and medical institutions worldwide, but also a test of our ability to work together in order to stem the spread of the virus. Unfortunately, it has presented a range of new challenges to democracy and human rights as well. There is a high risk of devastating COVID-19 outbreaks due to overcrowding, weak sanitation, and insufficient healthcare services. We need to make sure that low-income, rural, and peri-urban population across the globe has an access to an adequate water supply, sanitation, and hygiene. Providing safe water and sanitation is quite essential to prevent the severe and even life-threatening disease. Having said this, let me touch upon a very important topic. Tovuz Kazakh Akstapa region that I was elected as a representative is one of the regions bordering Armenia and faces environmental degradation because of Armenia's military aggression. People living in the villages closest to the front line are facing a lack of irrigation water. Blockage of water supply in turn provokes an ecological catastrophe. Of course, as a result, it creates difficulties to human development, economy, industry, and agriculture in the occupied territory, as well as in the frontline regions of Azerbaijan. Pollution and poisoning of water is another issue. Over the years, Armenia has done everything to pollute the Azerbaijani water sources with chemical and biological substances, which is a crystal example of violation not only the principles of territorial integrity of another state, but also a number of conventions and resolutions. I urge and call the government of Armenia to stop using water as a political tool against Azerbaijan. In my concluding remarks, I'd like once again to reiterate the fact that access to safe drinking water, adequate sanitation, and hygienic conditions is essential to protect human health in the event of all infectious disease, including COVID-19. In addition, I'd like also to thank all the frontline healthcare workers for continuing selflessly working to provide care to all the patients. Their dedication, commitment, and courage deserve our deepest gratitude and admiration. Thank you for attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. From this moment, the interpretation service is finished, so those who were following us in French and Russian can no longer do so. But of course, we will continue our meeting until the end. And our next speaker is our Vice President, Lord Bonas from the UK. Your microphone. Yep.
Okay.
Very good.
Okay. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear
you.
Right,
I'm sorry. Mr. President, Secretary General, colleague, Mr. President, Secretary General, colleagues, good afternoon, and thank you for giving me the floor. Thank you for arranging this webinar this afternoon, concentrating on human rights and democracy. Now, I acknowledge that there are some governments that have used the opportunity of this crisis to take powers which are both undemocratic and contrary to the accepted human rights standards. In other countries, however, the majority of governments have largely had support and confidence of the population during the peak of the crisis. But as we hopefully approach a lessening of the restrictions, there is a danger of a loss of trust and patience, a failure to set out a realistic program of how restrictions will be eased, contradictory statements, justification of past actions or inactions, and very little messages of hope, which are necessary for the maintenance of morale and trust. I'd like to draw my attention to one particular human rights concern, which is the subject of much discussion in the United Kingdom, and that is, as we approach relaxation, there's great concern that increased freedom will not be allowed to those over 70, and I declare an interest, Mr. President, especially those who may have some underlying medical conditions. But many of those who fit that description have, before the virus, been working, going about, traveling, and in my belief that it would be discriminatory and against human rights if they were not allowed to continue, subject of course to them having the appropriate advice, but then having the choice as to whether or not to follow it. On the subject of democracy and involvement of national parliaments, there's a real risk, as the functions of parliament are restricted, there's a temptation to government to retain the freedom of action, the abnormal becomes the normal. But it will lead to reduced scrutiny, and not just on the situation regarding COVID-19, but on the other major issues of the day. And I think the contribution from our colleagues from Sweden were particularly interesting in how they had managed to deal with this. Speaking of my experience in the second chamber of the United Kingdom Parliament, we have a situation where the vast majority of our work is now being done virtually. And it's not the same as meeting colleagues in person. I accept that the circumstances of the second chamber of the United Kingdom aren't typical, if only because of our average age. But I fear that the development of virtual working is becoming an objective in itself, and also an objective to keep as many members away as possible. My last point, quickly, is that Parliament must press for cooperation and coordination between states. If the present circumstances have shown anything, it is that national boundaries can't solve issues of this kind, and it underlines our interdependence. In Europe and elsewhere, and I give this as an example, not exclusive example at all, but an example, tourism and aviation may not be a fashionable concern prior to the virus in the light of climate change concerns. But today we find ourselves in different circumstances where millions of people, their jobs, their businesses, and the economies of countries and regions are threatened by a major loss of prosperity unless those tourist and travel opportunities are opened up again. It cannot be managed by individual countries. There's no good having a situation where you can leave one country, but you can't enter the other. It's no good being able to leave one country if the hotels aren't open. It is an example, but I believe it is a good example of where we must be working together with all the established institutions. And it's the job of Parliament to make sure that governments are working together and pursuing that cooperation, which is so badly needed. It's going to be a very, very important role for national parliaments. Mr. President, Secretary General, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lord Bonas. I ask Vice President Dobre to be a little second patient because Director Gisladottir has to leave us. So I'll give first the floor to Vice President Kari Eriksson, who wanted to speak before the dear Director, and then the dear Director to close, and then we move to you. Kari Eriksson.
Thank you very much. I will be very brief in meeting Ingebjörg, and thank you very much for your speech. I just want to highlight the third issue you raised, that was opportunities. And I think it's a very important issue that we are debating in our parliaments and in our parliamentary assembly in OSCE, because after this crisis, we will have huge challenges in many ways. We have been discussing some of them here. And we also have to look at the opportunities, how we can make things better than it was before. And on the other hand, not experience any setbacks in what we had earlier achieved. So that was just, I think it's a very good reminder from you, which I think we should bring in mind as parliamentarians when we do our work. We have one crisis, but we also have opportunities that can help us when we are going to rebuild our countries. So thank you, Ingebjörg.
Thank you very much. And now, Ingebjörg, you have the floor.
Thank you. Can you hear me and see me now as well? Okay, great. Very good. Well, thanks again for giving me this opportunity to address this group of parliamentarians, and also to listen to them and hearing about all the things that are taking place in different countries, and how the parliaments in respective countries are addressing their tasks and how they're dealing with the challenges that they are facing. Maybe just a few things to mention here before I leave the meeting. First of all, as I mentioned in my intervention, many of the challenges to democracy and human rights we have seen before the crisis have been further exposed in the last 2 months. And some of you have also mentioned this. I'm here referring to the roles and responsibilities of the executive versus the parliament. What I did not mention, but I should do, is also the judiciary and the problems that the judiciary is facing. Also, the human rights implications of increased surveillance that some of you also mentioned, but also increase in domestic violence that was mentioned by some of you also, and how this affects vulnerable groups, such as Roma people and migrants, those who are, in the worst position in the society before the crisis are those who are most vulnerable during the crisis as well. So we really need to look at these groups like migrants and Roma and other minority groups. We, as I mentioned, we are monitoring the situation. We are documenting it. We are going to write a report on this to share with the participating states. And as my predecessor, Mr. Link, mentioned, I hope that we will be able to provide some recommendation. And I will at least, I will submit this request to the people that are working on this. There is a task force in ODIHR that I established that is working on this, and I will tell them that this is something that came up in this meeting. One of the issues that have been coming up again and again in the intervention is about the elections and how to go about the elections in this situation. As you probably know, we had to withdraw our missions, election monitoring missions from Serbia and from North Macedonia, and we could not observe in Mongolia and in Poland. We had conveyed the message to the Polish government that we would not be able to observe the elections if they had taken place on Sunday. But fortunately, it has been decided to postpone it. But we don't know when. But most likely in July. And then we need to rethink how can we observe elections in this situation. It's very likely that we will, I think it goes without saying, it will be quite challenging to have this election observation mission with a full-scale mission with the long-term expert group and long-term and short-term observers and parliamentarians. I think it is, we will be faced with that we need to take some kind of measures to try to ensure that we can observe in one way or another, but not with a full-scale mission. And then it's important that this is not used as a pretext to kind of change, for permanently the way we go about election observation. Because we have a methodology that is very important to safeguard and ensure that is supported and safeguarded. And although we might need to take some measures in this crisis situation, because this is an unprecedented situation we are in, so we need sometimes to take unprecedented measures to deal with it. But that does not tell us that this is how we go about it in the future. And we cannot use the crisis as a pretext to further to curtail human rights or democratic principles. So that is, I think, very important. Civil society organizations, the difficulties they are facing because they cannot demonstrate, they cannot gather, but also budget because of financial implication of the crisis. I think a lot of civil society organizations are facing difficulties, and it is important, as some of you have already mentioned, to ensure that they can play their vital role as, if you like, a watchdog, or to ensure that there are checks and balances in our systems. So let me stop here, but just to at the end to mention, the opportunities. There are opportunities. Crisis is always difficult and can be quite threatening at times, but there are always opportunities also in crisis to look at things and maybe how we can do things differently and create better societies, more transparent, more inclusive societies. So let's aim for that, to use the crisis to do exactly that. But I'll stop here, and again, thank you all for giving me this opportunity to exchange opinions with you, present what we are doing, and listening to what you are doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Ingebjörg. Thank you very much for your time and for staying a little longer. Of course, the ODIHR is a very specific and very well oiled, I'd say, methodology when it comes to election observation missions. So I look forward also to the discussion that our election experts will have on the 12th of May to see also if we can find some creative ways of conducting meaningful election observation missions in some of the countries where we will observe in the fall, and maybe try to be creative in finding ways to do the kind of election observation missions that we normally do together. But thank you again very much for your timing, and look forward to seeing you soon in this kind of platforms. Now, next speaker is Vice President Victor Paul Dobre. Sorry, Victor, for waiting, but now the time is yours. Yes, we do. Yes, we do, Victor. Go ahead. You are muted now. Victor, you're muted now. Just unmute your microphone. Very good. Go ahead now.
Good?
Yes, yes.
Dear friends, I am very glad to see you and to hear you. And I am very glad that you are in a good health in these difficult, dangerous times. I also congratulate President Tsereteli and Secretary General Montella for organizing such activity during this period. We have a lot of reunion, debate. I can tell you that we work a little more than in normal time. Concerning Romania, we are now near of a peak of pandemic. We have 898 deaths. We have more than 14,000 infected people, but we are also more than 6,500 recovered. We take the first measure preventive in January. We introduce the control and quarantine for foreigners which come in Romania in February. We closed the school 11 March, and 14 March our president introduced state of emergency, which was extended once again in 14 April. Both decree about state emergency was validated by the Parliament of Romania with a very large majority. We hope that on 14 May we stop the state emergency, but we keep a lot of measures for the weeks, for the next weeks, till the level of pandemic, and the specialists can tell us what we make to protect the population. I can speak about Parliament. Parliament of Romania work during all this period. We have reunion, especially online, but we debate in plenary session, we debate in commission, and this, I think, is the best message can make the parliament to be there, to be active. I can tell you that next Monday, the health minister will be in the parliament report about sanitary situation. After 1 week, the Prime Minister will present in our Parliament a report about the activity of government during the state of emergency, 2 months of state emergency. The day after, will be the Home Minister will present the report about the activity of the fourth institution. The most problem and abuse can arrive from this institution. I tell you at the informal reunion of the Bureau that the sanitary crisis will be solved by the specialists. The economic crisis must be solved by the bank and government. But to keep good condition, the democracy, the respect of human rights, respect of freedom. This is the charge of the parliamentary. And it's, I think, what is most important in this situation. The parliament must work. The parliamentary made their activity. This direction, I appreciate very much our activity. I am very proud because our institution, OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, it's alive, it's work. We are here, we debate, we give statements, and once again, thank you, Roberto, for your activity. And I wish you all to meet again, help, and to meet you physically, but will be. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vice President Dobre, dear Victor.
Thank you very much, Victor. Thank you. And see you soon.
Next speaker is Tural Ganyaliev from Azerbaijan.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, very good.
Yes. Dear Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, dear friends, colleagues, it's indeed very great honor for me to address this very important and very interesting webinar as the new elected member of the Parliament of Azerbaijan. And before delivering my remarks, I would like to share with you some of my personal insight, because this is really, on a personal note, this is really today very sad day for myself, because just 28 years ago, the armed forces of Armenia invaded and occupied the city of Shusha in the Nagorno-Karabakh region of the Republic of Azerbaijan, where I was born and I grew up as a child. So when I was 12 years old, Armenian forces invaded and we were expelled completely. All Azerbaijanis were expelled and we were subjected to ethnic cleansing since 1992. But unfortunately, it has been already 28 years that we cannot return back to our native lands, and we were denied of all our basic human rights. We cannot exercise our property rights. We cannot return back to our territories. Even we cannot visit the graveyards of our family members who lie in occupied territories of Azerbaijan. So coming back to the topic of today's discussion, yes, as we are living in very difficult and challenging times, as the global pandemic of coronavirus affects all our countries, and no country is insured against it. And I have to say that we can defeat this virus only by coming together with mutual support and by joint efforts only. And my government, I have to say that as the newly elected member of parliament, I have watched the government of Azerbaijan is doing all
its best in order to prevent the spread of this very dangerous virus. And Azerbaijan reacted to the new situation quickly, timely, and adequately. And from the first days of this pandemic, my government, my country has been in close contact with the World Health Organization, and delegation of WHO visited Azerbaijan, and we got acquainted with, they got acquainted with the situation, and the government of Azerbaijan is following every rules, every requirements that the WHO issued regarding this pandemic. I have to say that more than 20 hospitals in Azerbaijan have been allocated for the treatment of coronavirus, which is very positive thing for as the member of parliament seeing this allocation, and also many laboratory tests, some new medical equipment, supplies necessary for the diagnosis and treatment of the virus have been brought to Azerbaijan. So far, we have more than 160,000 tests have been administered across the country, and production of protective and other medical supplies was quickly started to meet the domestic demand. So we are taking all these measures in order to spread the coronavirus and in order to have positive dynamic which has been observed during these last weeks. And of course, the WHO also cited Azerbaijan as an exemplar country which successfully fought against this pandemic. So, but unfortunately, when we look at the situation in the occupied territories of Azerbaijan, I have to say that unfortunately, very, very unfortunately, on 31st of March this year, just a couple of weeks ago, the election show was held in the occupied territories of Azerbaijan by controls. So as the Azerbaijani community of Nagorno-Karabakh region, which I'm also heading, I have addressed the Armenian community living in the occupied territories, and I called the occupant regime not to organize this election because it would, of course, endanger those Armenians living in Nagorno-Karabakh region. But unfortunately, our calls were ignored, and what we have seen after the election, so-called election, of course, in Nagorno-Karabakh region, we have seen the spread of the virus and the increase in the number of the infected people. So at a time when the world is facing this pandemic, and of course, despite the threat posed it by human lives, Armenia and the occupying regime remaining true to their disposition, continue their illegal activities, which is very sad. And of course, I am using this opportunity one more time to address the Armenia and the illegal regime in the Nagorno-Karabakh region of Azerbaijan that it is time that they withdrew their troops from the occupied territories of Azerbaijan. It's time that they allowed the Azerbaijani population come back to our native lands. Only after the peaceful settlement of this conflict, only after the return of Azerbaijanis to their native land, it would be possible to talk about the peaceful coexistence, by the way, which we have been advocated for many, many, many years. In my last statements, I have stated many times that we are ready for the peaceful coexistence with the Armenians in the Nagorno-Karabakh region of Azerbaijan, that we can fight any pandemic, any virus, any threat that is facing our globe. But unfortunately, as the IDPs, we have not seen any reaction. We haven't seen any reaction from the Armenia or from the occupying regime. They completely ignore our calls. Last but not least, of course, I have to say that Azerbaijan, of course, as the member of parliament, I have to say that we recognize the indispensable role of parliamentary diplomacy for enhancing security in the OSCE region and beyond. And of course, this should be done through promotion and ensuring by parliamentarians, by all of us, respect for the principles and commitments of the OSCE, starting with the Helsinki Act, which is one of the main pillars of the OSCE. And violations of these principles of interstate relations lie at the core of current OSCE-wide crisis, and all our efforts should be directed in order to eliminate the consequences that we are facing. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Terrell. Just for the record, as also this webinar is broadcast on Facebook and our YouTube channel. Of course, enrollment to this webinar was open to all delegations, so everybody could have enrolled. And as you know, normally in our proceedings, when a delegation makes some important and strong criticism of another participating states, we normally ask the right to reply from that country. But now the Armenian colleagues are not connected to this. Of course, if they wish to connect later on in the program, we could still give them a chance to reply. But I just want to appeal to all participants also to use this platform and to use the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly in general, you know, for the spirit that we have, which is trying to build bridges. So try to always keep that in mind, and let's try to use this Parliamentary Assembly as a way to look into each other's eyes and try to build bridges between us. But now I give the floor to Jean-Claude Mikalev from Malta.
Thanks a lot, Secretary General, and it's great to find you all in good health. And I remark and I emphasize what you have just highlighted, that yes, this is the right platform to build bridges, and it's good to see you all comfortable in your offices and homes in my case. But unfortunately, as we stand all comfortable, there are over 200 migrants literally stranded ajar in the Mediterranean Sea, while over 600,000 more migrants are waiting on the shores of Libya. This definitely is a situation which we cannot tolerate anymore. And when I say we're not speaking about us Maltese or Italians, but we're speaking about each and every one of us that has Europe at heart. And therefore, the OSCE should definitely prioritize this issue. And when I speak about this issue, I'm speaking about human trafficking, which is definitely a thing to deplore. It's inhuman, not only during this time, but always. Surely, like anything that is illegal in times of emergency, in times of pandemic, and an unprecedented one, as we're living, any criminal mind will take all the advantages and do the utmost to make more money and try and focus on business models that has been the trend, unfortunately, now even more that we are approaching summer and having good weather. And therefore, if we just close an eye or we just consider our unique parameters, then that will surely not deter the business model of people smuggling. Therefore, I would like to use this platform, our OSCE, and even this particular dialogue to prioritize this matter. Definitely, we need to embark on a tangible way on how we should tackle human trafficking. Besides that, let us not forget the Head of States conference held in Berlin way back in January, prior all this coronavirus pandemic, where we have committed ourselves to stabilize the situation in Libya, a situation which is surely not only endangering its own people, but all of us, each and every European. Therefore, having the OSCE and our friends around the world with a keen interest in Europe, surely this is the right platform where we should not only work hand in hand with the United Nations, with the EU and even the Arab League, but therefore be there for each and every human. In a tangible manner, we need to cooperate in planning coordinated thresholds for each country based on a population and area ratio. Like that, we won't be just talking about the situation, but we will be
tackling this situation in the best possible manner. So far, only Portugal has offered Malta to accept 6 migrants, and this is surely only too little. It's not too late though, and yet again, I would like to see each and every one of you put forward this dilemma, this whole saga that has been going for ages. And as I started my address, there are over 600,000 waiting to move on to Europe. Surely we need to be there for them as much as we need to be for our people. Human trafficking is unacceptable, and doing nothing will surely see us playing a role in this inhuman way of dealing with our fellows. Therefore, this is a clear situation where human rights have to be respected, as we are discussing, while making sure that we keep total control of our democratic values in such state of emergencies. Our values and principles sound great on paper, but will make more sense if put to practice. I look forward not only to each and every one of your support, but also to be a voice, not only for the immigrants who are trying to avoid all these inhuman situations back in their countries, but also we need to stand tall with our people who are receiving this problem. And no, this is not a Maltese issue, this is not an Italian issue, but this is a European issue. And once again, and finally, I wish that this message will not fall on deaf ears, but we will see each and every one of us work together, as Roberto Montella have just highlighted before my message. And I'm sure with the President's approach and with each and every one of us, will make sure to take the right opportunity in this difficult time to regenerate Europe in a strong, and I emphasize on the strong showcase of solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Claude, and I definitely invite you to participate at the 26th of May webinar on migration issues. The Migration Committee just met last week, and we really want to try to give to this issue a long-term perspective. Our members don't want to deal with this issue just from a national policy kind of perspective, but try to address the issue of movement of people in a more long-term perspective. So I look forward to that seminar as well. Now, Amina Agazada from Azerbaijan. Amina, you have the floor.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Dear colleagues, Mr. Chairman, thank you for giving me the floor. My name is Amina Agazada, and I am the newly elected member of Parliament of Azerbaijan. I feel very privileged for being here, and it's my honor today to address you. Now I would like to briefly touch upon the suggested issues for consideration and measures taken in our country in the context of pandemic. In order to prevent a global pandemic in our country, the necessary measures are being taken in accordance with the recommendation of the World Health Organization and the task force under the Cabinet of Ministers. Given the decrease in the rate of the infection and the recovery trend, a plan or a phased exit from the special quarantine regime is being implemented. From the first day of the pandemic, a clear time limit on the emergency measures was set, first until April 20, then extended until May 31st. On April 27 and 4th May, a number of restrictions were relaxed. However, I want to note with regret that after the quarantine has been softened, an increase in the number of infected persons has been observed. Regarding human rights derogation, I would like to note that respect for human rights has always been a priority for our country. To this end, a number of administrative sanctions were introduced to prevent any action of people breaking the quarantine regime. These measures are aimed solely to ensure compliance with the quarantine regime by all persons, regardless of their social status, position, or membership in a political party. As an example, I can say that in the framework of action aimed at observing the rules of social isolation, a number of isolation who grossly violated the rule of isolation were punished accordingly. In order to protect human life and health in the context of the global pandemic, penitentiary and medical services have moved to an intensified mode of work. The situation in this area is regularly studied by a monitoring group consisting of relevant officials of the Ministry of Justice and representatives of civil society and nutrition of convicted and detained persons, food supply, their assortment and quality are also monitored on a daily basis. At the same time, on March 26, 200 prisoners have been released based on court decisions. On April 6, President of the Republic of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, has signed a decree pardoning 176 prisoners aged over 65 who are in need of special care due to their age and health in connection with the spread of coronavirus infection in the world. Information, no coronavirus cases detected in prisons. At the meeting of the Parliament, on May 1st, draft laws on humanization of penal policy and decriminalization of punishment were adopted. It was proposed to amend the Criminal and Administrative Offences Code. About 200 amendments to the Criminal Code and 40 amendments to the Code of Administrative Offences are planned. According to the law, about 40 crimes will be decriminalized. At this time of collective hardship, citizens are looking to the police for professionalism, protection, assistance, and guidance. The police have a distinct role in making sure the lockdown is followed with minimum difficulties to population. In this regard, I would like to emphasize that police activities in Azerbaijan have been conducted with empathy and evading respect for rights and human dignity, while ensuring all precautions to guard against the spread of virus. This activity is conducted for the benefit of the population and is aimed at raising self-awareness of citizens. In the context of combating the global pandemic of COVID-19 in our country, all states and local executive bodies, including the parliament, take organized measures to prevent coronavirus, carry out preventive work. In connection with the application of the quarantine regime, sanitary, epidemiological, and other measures, it was decided to hold parliamentary meetings as well as meetings of parliamentary committees and commissions in real time through a video conference system. The first video conference in Azerbaijan parliament was held on March 29. The video conference was held between the chairperson of the parliament committee and the leadership of Azerbaijan. In this difficult time for us, we do our best trying to keep balance without going over this fine line where the need for derogation should in no way be regarded as disrespect or violation of human rights. I strongly believe that we will defeat the pandemic together, maintaining friendship, mutual support, and solidarity. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Amina. And the last speaker on my list is Kamil Aydin from Turkey. Kamil, you have the floor.
Yes, I know you are fed up with, I think, but I'm not gonna.
No, not at all. Not at all. Not at all. I'm enjoying this.
I'm gonna be very short. I am gonna be very short, Roberto. And just before coming to the point, I would like to say that I agree with my colleague, Maltese colleague, Jean-Claude, about the issue of migration as a member of a country who suffered a lot, with the 4 million migrants within the country. And And I really appreciate your plan about that issue. Of course, dear colleagues, we come together through video conference with a particular topic, respecting human rights and maintaining democratic control during state of emergency, with particular references to corona pandemic period, of course. But, I would like to draw your attention to a very different point of view about the pandemic. In the sense of freedom and rights, I think and I wholeheartedly believe that the priority should be given to the freedom of living above all. In other words, we cannot have the right to risk and jeopardize any single individual life in the name of freedom of speech or freedom of media, especially during such a vicious global pandemics. That's why I would like to draw your attention to the delicate balance between, honestly, freedom and security in order to get rid of such, epidemic, sort of turned to be a pandemic anyway. So in that case, under these circumstances, how we can manage? So how we can get rid of it, of course. And a couple of days ago, yesterday, we had more or less a similar meeting with the NATO Parliamentary Assembly members. And more or less, we come to conclusion with them as well. And I would like to share the conclusion with you as well. We can, of course, get rid of this with a strong and sturdy coordination and cooperation among us, and sharing correct information and knowledge rather than the distorted ones. And with those, last words, I wish you all a healthy and secure future. Very good evening then. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Camille. I've really enjoyed it very much, actually. But as before I give the floor now to Vice President Kari Eriksson to make some concluding remarks, and then to our president, I just wanted to say that we are doing this for the second time. We are learning by doing. Today we've had some delegations who have been probably overrepresented in this. We, of course, open up for anybody who wants to speak. We have not put any restrictions, but as we're going along, and in the future webinar, it will be on more political military security issues, which are very contested. We will try to find some rules. Of course, if there are many speakers, we will try to limit the speakers of each delegation by maybe 2, maximum 3 speakers, government and opposition. And of course, this is an exception for bureau members. Bureau members they're not considered as member of one delegation, but they are considered as members of the bureau, so they have the right to speak. But I just wanted to say that apologies for those who have been less represented, but of course the possibility to participate was open to everyone. So those who have not chosen to do so, we don't take responsibility for that. But that said, now I give the floor to Vice President Kari Eriksson for some concluding remarks, and then to the President. Kari, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of you who have participated in this dialogue and debate. It has been a pleasure to listen to all the important issues that you have raised. I think it's 2 kind of main topics that we have addressed. It's the phase of the crisis, which has been most in our minds, and I think Ingebjørg Gisladottir summarized it very well. I would just like to add the migrant issue that came up in the last session of the debate, and also the international collaboration, which is very important in this crisis, and to use both internal bodies in our own organization, but also the international collaboration, which you are doing very splendidly, I think, the President and the Secretariat, to try to came to conclusions or to discussions that are similar in the different organizations. So I think that's very, very good. I think it's everybody has pointed to especially human rights and also democracy rights, like elections, and they have been pointed to 1991 documents. And I think that's important messages to us in the committee. I also would like to just emphasize the role of the truth in the debates and to seek the truth in the political debates, because we know that disinformation and accusations and trying to manipulate the truth is also a very threat to the democracy. So I think also we have to find measures how we as an organization can both emphasize and also strengthen what is the truth and what is the essence, what is the right in the different political debates which is going on. And then I think the important message to us also is how we can address this crisis in a way that we can rebuild our society with more democracy, with more human rights, so that we can make our societies more sustainable to address the crisis we know will come to every country after this crisis. I think Lord Bowness mentioned hope, and I think that's a very good word to have as a last comment, because we as parliamentarians, we have to have hope that our society will develop to something better for the people in their everyday life. And that is our biggest commission. And that's why we are elected parliamentarians. That's why we are engaging in OSCE. It's to make the people's lives better, to ensure that the human rights is a right for everybody. And we have to remember that no people are born vulnerable. It is the society and the circumstances that makes them vulnerable. And as a last point, I just want to highlight the gender perspective issue, to how important it is for us in the societies in this crisis to ensure women access to income. Many women has lost their jobs and their income. Their income is necessary for the women to be independent. And we have to secure the healthcare for women so that they can have reproductive health and safe abortions. We know that many women are raped, exposed for severe violence, and they have to have access to good healthcare. And the third issue about the gender perspective is that we have to maintain the police and the judiciary system so that they can be investigated and domestic violence can be brought to court, because violence against women is not a human dimension, although it's performed behind four walls in a family. It is a violation on human rights for women, and therefore we have to address also this, and we have to address the domestic violence in every society. We know it's growing. Michael Link was mentioning it. It's growing concern in the UN also, that it's in Norway we also have increased domestic violence reporting in this crisis. And at the very end, I want to thank you very much, Roberto, and the Secretariat and the whole staff for organizing this, and President for making this possible. And I will also give some thanks to my good colleagues, Kyriakos and Michael Links, who has been so engaged and so committed to have this realized. So thank you for a good debate. We will now go through all what you have put on the plate to see if there is some special issues we can take further in other seminars. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, dear Karin. Before giving the floor for final remarks to the President, let me make an invitation to all the participants to turn on their camera so that we can see everyone who was connected, and we can also make a nice snapshot of everybody who is in this chat so that we can see also the faces of those who have organized and participated in this. Again, I reiterate what I said at the beginning. I should have not moderated webinar. It should have been Andreas Baker, my colleague Andreas Baker. Unfortunately, he had issues with his family, so he couldn't, but Andreas is there connected. So thank you very much, Andreas. I can see you have followed our work, and thank you to you, Alexandra, and Angelique and Stephen for making also the technical aspects of this webinar successful. And please, yes, keep on turning on your cameras while the President takes the floor for some concluding remarks. Mr. President.
Well, thank you, Roberto, and thank you for your efficient work. It's not easy to moderate 3 hours, especially under this not very natural circumstances, but I think we are all quite acquainted already with the new rules. First, I'd like to say that if Lord Bonus is here, dear Peter, I know that you're already thinking how to rationalize our work also. These webinars, I can't imagine it because we had a private chat with Roberto. I understand it. We all need to say something, and that's the right thing. That's why this webinar is invented, created, and that's why we are doing that. And it's really great to hear your insights, your positions. We understand we are politicians, so sometimes there were statements which might be for another time, but anyway, I think for next webinars, I guess we will more, not to fit for purpose, but to have a more rational, let's say, structure of this webinar, just to use time properly and to listen to each other, because there are very, very valuable thoughts and ideas and offers. I guess we had a good speakers today, and also each of you, you had a very good analysis of the situation in your countries, but also we are thinking how to move ahead, how to go after this to normal life, and I think that it's one of the main objectives at this moment when we're talking about hope, when we're talking about the lessons which will be after this COVID pandemic, and opportunities. Of course, opportunities. The life is continuing, and we need those opportunities to be implemented. And we, as politicians, of course, have our wishes, our political, let's say, plans, different statements, and very easy, of course, to outline what's important. Important to, let's say, guarantee all the human rights, important to respect opposition, important to stick with the rules when it comes to election procedures, to be, not to curtail democracy when you're stating emergency situation or you have a curfew or whatever, and respecting gender, let's say, problems. And I fully agree with Kari that in emergency and in such situations, of course, risks are higher for women, for girls, and reproductive health issues. There are many things, but the main problem is how to implement all those things and how to guarantee to make sure that it's in place, that those things are placed. And I think our main, let's say, duty is that as parliamentarians to supervise this problem, this process, and to be, active in implementing our oversight work. And I guess you all have this desire. You have all these plans and ideas, and we will get all the information, all the notes, I think, which are worthy, and then we are not just shutting down computers, but we are also then outlining what are priorities from one webinar to another one. And meanwhile, I think we have to work in our parliaments and to work with others too. I myself and Roberto, we have permanent contact with the different leaders. For instance, yesterday I spoke with Azerbaijani speaker of parliament. Also, there will be with Armenians, in my neighborhood here, but also we are planning, as we said before, all the regional talks, delegations, the leaders, just to be sure that the ideas that we are discussing now are realistic, and our work is worthy to to ensure this oversight, parliamentary oversight process during this COVID. So thank you very much. It was extremely interesting. Believe me, even we're already accustomed that there are some statements which are like reports, and we also need that. We need this exchange of information, what's happening, but I think we need also more critical analysis. And in this situation, we should, even name and shame, or to say the right things when it comes to problems which are bothering our societies. And I guess that in coming weeks, we'll have a much more better situation with the COVID pandemic. There are already plateaus in many countries, and what I'm observing, I'm a medical doctor, but I see now that people, media, journalists, others, politicians are so educated in epidemiology, in the medical activities, and they get a lot of knowledge. I think with this knowledge, we will defeat this coronavirus for sure. But again, so that will be a huge experience, how we endure these difficult times. And I think that will be only key for success. As you said, all of you, solidarity, understanding of problems, and to work together. And this webinars also, I think we are, again, keeping those bridges that we have. And I'd like to thank our secretariat. I saw Andreas Baker is here. It's a very rare moment when we don't have intensive discussions with Andreas. But I'm keeping, of course, not only with Roberto, my contacts every day, but with all the staff. And once again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Just for your information, before we conclude, we had 35 countries represented and more than 120 participants, active participants. The figures of those who have seen the event are not available yet, but the previous one was seen by 1,200 people on Facebook. So that was quite a successful one, but we'll let you know this event, how many people have followed it. With this, I look forward to seeing some of you, the secretaries of delegations, on the 12th of May for an internal meeting that we will have. And next Friday, Gustavo will moderate a webinar on the first dimension with Congressman Richard Hudson and the members of the first committee. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Enjoy. I wish you health. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Molto bene. Ciao, Pia.
Okay, Roberto, thank you very much.
Bye,
Bye,
Peter.
bye everybody.
Bye. Thank you very much.